In this lecture, we'll take a look at ecological succession. The breakdown of this lecture is as follows. We'll take a look at natural disruption to ecosystems. We'll also take a look at natural selection, adaptation, and then finally wrap it up with the phenomenon known as ecological succession. Natural disruptions to ecosystems can occur in three basic patterns. We have episodic disruptions, which are events that can occur occasionally and usually have an irregularity to them, such as volcanic eruptions and droughts, meaning you can't set your calendar for when these things occur, but they do happen periodically. Well, maybe not periodically, I should say, but they do happen occasionally. Now, random disruptions are completely unpredictable. There's no regular pattern at all. You don't even expect them to happen, such as an asteroid impact. Very rare that they occur. They do happen, but there's no really predictability to them. So if you look like at a volcanic eruption, we can kind of get an idea that, all right, this volcano hasn't erupted in a while, so it's due to erupt. Whereas an asteroid, well, there's really no predictability to it at all. Now, a periodic disruption is something that is very predictable and does occur at regular intervals. This can include the daily rise and fall of the tides, the seasons from year to year, but there's also longer periodic patterns that have a big impact on our ecosystems, and especially over the long term. The first has to do with the Earth's orbit. So the Earth's orbit we know is an ellipse, but it actually can change from time to time. So this is known as orbital eccentricity. So the shape of the Earth's orbit can become more circular as opposed to being more elliptical like it is now, and this can lead to warmer summers or cooler summers depending on the shape of the Earth's orbit. And this has to do with the proximity to the sun. And so you can see the periodic frequency at which this occurs is on the age of about I'm not sure what this is thousands of years. I wanted to check that on about 100,000 years or so. Okay, now the other periodic episode that has to do with the Earth's position in the solar system has to do with its tilt. So we know that the Earth is tilted roughly at about 23 degrees, but that changes a little bit. So the current tilt is 23.4 degrees. Okay, that gives us cooler summers and warmer winters. However, every, let's say 50,000 years or so, that tilt changes. It can point in different or have a slightly different tilt in its axis with respect to its orbital plane, and so that therefore that can change the extremity of the extremes of the summer and the winters. And the third periodic disruption has to do with what we call the Earth's wobbling. This is called axial precession. So basically, right now, Earth's current position is that our north pole is pointing towards Polaris, what we call the North Star. But we expect some changes. So there's actually a 20,000 year cycle with this where the Earth might be tilted more towards Vega, a different star. So again, all these little positional changes of the Earth can have an effect on the ecosystems, because remember, the primary driver of ecosystems from an energy standpoint is solar radiation. So if the Earth is closer or it's tilted at a slightly different angle, then the amount of radiant energy that hits the Earth and where it strikes the Earth can affect the climate and thus ecosystems. So natural disruptions to Earth's ecosystems are nothing new. These have been happening for a long time, as recorded by what we call mass extinctions. So now the graph we're looking at is taking a look at the number of genera, right? If you remember in biology, you studied taxonomy, right? So a genus is a group of several species. So genera is the plural of that. And on the x-axis, we're looking at geologic time. So this would be the present day. And as we go to the left, we're going back all the way to the Cambrian period, which is about 540 million years ago. So we're going way back. Now, what's interesting is you can see overall, over the past 500 million years, there's been an increase in Earth's biodiversity. We've discussed how biodiversity is a very important component of ecosystems, and so biodiversity is important. and it's pretty clear the Earth is designed to promote the growth of biodiversity. But you will see in the fossil record episodes of what we call mass extinctions that result from some sort of natural disruption to the ecosystem. So let's take a look at the 5, or actually 6, as we're saying now, mass extinctions. The first one happened about 440 million years ago at the end of the Ordovician period. And this basically happened. It was an interesting situation where there appeared to be an excessive amount of plant growth in the Ordovician, and that basically led to global cooling because they pulled all the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which triggered an ice age. And then after that, there was a period of global warming as all the plants died because of the ice age, and so a lot of CO2 was released into the atmosphere. So that ended up causing a lot of flooding, and therefore, so there was kind of like, it was a tough time period for life on planet Earth, and so you can see there was a drastic dip in the number of genera on the planet, and we call that a mass extinction. Now, the second one happened about 365 million years ago, and this happened at the end of the Devonian period. And again, this seemed to be related to, again, plant growth. An excessive amount of nutrients from deeply rooted plants released a lot of nutrients into the oceans and into the aquatic ecosystems. So you had these huge blooms of algae that were just unsustainable. They drove down oxygen levels and led to a great extinction. That led to, again, the first extinction, we lost about 86% of species, 75% at the end of the Devonian. Now, the next mass extinction you probably saw would be at the end of the Permian Triassic extinction 252 million years ago, 96% loss of species, probably the greatest mass extinction that we have recorded in the fossil record. Again, this seems to be related to an amount of CO2 present in the atmosphere. So there was a lot of, it's thought that there was a lot of volcanic activity that released CO2 into the atmosphere, led to a global warming event. And there's some concerns that basically there was a lot of pollution as a result of all that volcanic activity, and led to quite a bit of extinction. Can you tell when the next one is based on the fossil record? Well, right there at the end of the Triassic extinction, about 200 billion years ago. Again, a lot of volcanic eruptions releasing CO2 again into the atmosphere, causing global warming and acidifying the oceans, leading to, again, quite about an 80% loss of life, of species, according to the fossil record. The next one was at the end of the Cretaceous period, probably the most famous mass extinction event, 66 million years ago. Pretty much agreed upon that this happened as a result of the asteroid that hit the Yucatan Peninsula, and led to quite a bit of climate change. A lot of debris was released into the atmosphere, causing global temperatures to drop significantly, and it's thought that dinosaurs, who would be ectothermic like reptiles, may not have been able to handle this, and only those that were endothermic could adapt to the colder temperatures, were the ones that survived. So again, this led to about a 60 to 70% loss of biodiversity. And when I say survived, we're talking about what reptilian species were able maybe to make it past that. The thought that birds are really an extant species of what may have been the dinosaurs. There's some interesting thoughts about that. And birds, of course, have a lot of similarities to reptiles, except they are warm-blooded. So again, there's some interesting thoughts on that. But getting back to the point, these are the 5 known mass extinctions to occur in the Earth's past. And notice they all seem to have a lot to do with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And we'll talk about that when we look at how the greenhouse effect works. But the greenhouse effect is a natural thing on planet Earth. Basically, CO2 is a heat trapping gas. And so it's important that it is in the atmosphere, because it does help to make Earth's climate more moderate. But higher levels of CO2 lead to warmer temperatures, and therefore some need for adaptability for living organisms. Now, I did mention there were 6 mass extinctions because many scientists today agree that we are living currently in the Holocene extinction. That is our current epoch or time period in the geologic history of Earth. And we are seeing now, because of human activity, that the extinction rate is at a minimum 1,000 times higher than the background extinction rate, meaning human activity has increased the rate at which species are going extinct at a minimum 1,000 times higher than it normally is. There are some estimates that it may be upwards of 10,000 times faster. So this is a concern that we may be seeing a drop in species at an alarming rate in our future. And we want to, that's one of the reasons why we have this class, is to understand the impact of our actions on ecosystems and the species that inhabit them and what we can do to help them. Let's talk a little bit more about some natural disruptions that happened in the past. And ice ages, of course, are well-known disruptions that happen periodically from in the Earth's past. And you can see there's some regularity to it, that basically every 100,000 years or so, there seems to be this period where we have what are called a glacial period, where a lot of the Earth's surface is covered with glaciers. A lot of the land is covered with glaciers. And the major causes of this seem to be changes in the Earth's orbit. So we mentioned the Earth's eccentricity, its tilt, etc. And so basically this kind of goes along with that orbital eccentricity that we see going on here, leading to changes in temperature. The amount of CO2, if the CO2 drops, then it gets colder if it goes up. And we can actually see that in this graph. You can see how these increases in temperature, these interglacial periods, I should say, or where the temperature is warm, notice that the CO2 is also high. So there's a very, very strong correlation, and that's because CO2 is a greenhouse gas. Whenever CO2 is low, that's when we would have an interglacial period. Okay, so, and you can see we've been in a glacial period where we actually have a true ice age. And you can see that we've been kind of living in a long interglacial period. A lot of scientists think that we should be starting to cool, but unfortunately we're actually warming a bit. And we'll talk more about that as the course progresses. The bottom graph is showing the amount of dust. This is looking at dust concentration, and you notice every time that we have a glacial period or an ice age, the dust increases. So the last ice age here, which we see with low temperatures and low carbon dioxide, had increased dust concentration. The reason for that is because during an ice age, during a glacial maximum, as we can see here, this was 18,000 years ago, notice how many deserts there are. A lot of the Earth was covered with deserts, and the reason for this is because a lot of the water that would ordinarily be cycling through the hydrologic or the water cycle is locked in these glaciers. And so the weather becomes quite dry, and you have expansion of deserts. You compare to what 18,000 years ago to what it is today, the deserts are much smaller, and we have a lot more forest because of an active hydrologic cycle. Water is moving through the hydrologic or water cycle quite freely because it's not trapped up in as many glaciers as it would be during an ice age. Changes in sea level have a lot to do with ice ages as well, and we can see from this graphic here at the bottom left that definitely there's been changes in sea level of 130 meters or more in Earth's history. And so that's like a change in sea level of greater, a meter is a little bit longer than a yard, so that's like about 1.5 football fields change. And that's pretty significant. That's just in the level. How it encroaches in on land is even more significant, right? And so we can see this is also tightly correlated to temperature. So whenever we have an ice age, sea level tends to drop, and this is because a lot of the water is locked into the glaciers. So not only do we have little rain causing a lot of deserts on the planet, but sea level is lower, and that leads can lead to a lot of extinction of coastal species as well. Conversely, when temperatures were warmer, you have a higher sea level, and this is because a lot of the water that was locked in glaciers that were on land on the continents would melt and empty into the ocean, increasing the volume. Plus, as the Earth warms, an interesting thing that happens to the water itself is it expands. There's this phenomenon known as thermal expansion, and we can see that even in our local area here in Florida, that the sea level during the summer is about 6 inches higher than it is during the winter, simply because it's warmer, and that spreads the molecules out a bit and expands the sea level. Let's talk now about natural selection, because what we've just demonstrated in our lecture so far is that Earth is dynamic and it changes quite a bit. And so organisms that are inhabiting this planet must be designed to meet with the challenges that occur. So this adaptability is important, and adaptations occur primarily through what we call natural selection, which is basically determines which species is going to be able to survive and reproduce. You may have heard that natural selection is kind of like the catchphrase is survival of the fittest, but in reality, that's an incomplete thought. Really, it should be that natural selection is survival and reproduction of the fittest. And this is kind of how it works. One of the things that you need for natural selection is differential reproductive success, where basically there is individuals that must compete for, there must be assortative mating, there must be individuals that will have more offspring than others. This will lead to fitness. Individuals who have more beneficial characteristics, meaning they can survive longer and mate more, will produce more offspring than those individuals that don't have higher fitness. So fitness isn't about like being able to run a mile here or anything. Fitness could come from the ability to have proper camouflage in your environment, so you survive longer and have more mating opportunities. So you're going to have more offspring, and your genes will go on to the next generation more frequently, right? It also could come in other forms too, such as strength or speed. Dominant male elephant seals, for example, will outcompete other males, and they're stronger and bigger and get more mating opportunities with the females, and therefore more of their genes that give them a size advantage are sent to the next generation. Now, the other thing that must occur here is that any trait must be heritable. It has to be a characteristic that can be inherited in the offspring. So this is the idea that an acquired characteristic, like we'll use a human example, for example, a tattoo. Maybe a tattoo makes you look cool or strong. I don't know. I doubt that. But if that were to happen, then you were away more mating opportunities. Your offspring wouldn't be born with that regrettable tattoo, right? That's an acquired characteristic. Or if you were to dye your hair blonde or black to try to make yourself look more attractive, doesn't mean your offspring are going to have dyed blonde or black hair, right? They're going to inherit whatever trait, whatever genes determine the hair color from both the mother and the father. So again, any trait here must be passed on, and this leads to an adaptation. Any heritable characteristic that leads to greater survivorship and reproduction. Let's look at an example. Here we can see in this population of plants, we have inherent variability or variation in the genetics of this population. Individuals of this plant population have characteristics that make them have lighter leaf cover or dark leaf color. Well, this can lead to selection. Basically, the environment may pose a challenge to this population, and it turns out that the plants that are greener, whether it means they have greater photosynthetic rate, who knows, that doesn't matter, but the point is that they survive longer. The others are selected against. They have lower fitness than the green plants, and so they die off, which means when they die off, they don't send their genes on to the next generation as a greater rate as the plant that's still alive and will be able to reproduce more during its lifetime. And so what we eventually see is the descent with modification. Now the population is inherently much more green because the traits of the individuals with a higher fitness have been passed on to subsequent generations. Here's a great example of how that might look in the Galapagos finches, Darwin's finches. These have been studied for decades, and they're a great example of how natural selection works. So what we see here in the blue bars in this graph here is looking at this is the number of finches with their beaks being measured. So beak depth is how thick their beak is. And so you can see in 1976, all the finches on the island were measured, and their beak depth or size averaged right about 8.8 millimeters. So that was what we call the pre-drought average. So now there were some finches that had smaller beaks and some that had large beaks. So you can see there was inherent variation in the genetics of the size of beaks in finches, which is important. They all just didn't have the same beak size. Well, a drought occurred the next year, and in 1978, the surviving individuals were found to have a post-drought beak average of 9.8. So what we see in the population is more of these finches, these ground finches, had larger beaks. And so what we can infer here is that during the drought, there were fewer seeds. So that makes sense. Trees weren't able to produce as many seeds as normal because there was a lack of rain. Well, this led to a struggle, a competition for resources. The birds with larger beaks were able to eat the larger seeds and the fewer seeds that were present. And so they had a greater survivorship. They passed their traits on to the next generation. And really, this is a design in nature to help populations adapt. We can see every once in a while, you can see there is this somewhat episodic event where there's a drought. It actually is fairly regular because we now know this has to do with El Nino. We'll talk about El Nino in the next unit, or I'm sorry, in Unit 4. Basically, you have dry years occasionally on the Galapagos Islands. And so that variation that's built into the groundfinch helps the species survive. If they all had small beaks and there was no variation, the whole population would go extinct. So natural selection here prevents the groundfinches from going extinct. It's a very, very important dry year. You can see beak size increases. They keep the population going. And then when it's wet again, you start to see more smaller finched beaks come back. And so really a wonderful design here in nature to help this species move on. They're still finches. They're not turning into anything else. They're just adapting to their environment. We can see our crops are actually going through natural selection. Not meaning our crops, but the weeds that we try to eliminate to grow our crops are going through natural selection. What's happening, according to the data that you see here, is that as time goes on and we continue to apply pesticides, more cases of herbicide-resistant weeds are occurring. And what this means is we'll spray pesticides onto the weeds. They'll die, but remember there's variation in the weed population. Some of them are resistant or aren't affected by this particular chemical pesticide. They survive, get more mating opportunities, and pass that resistance on to the next generation. And so we can see that the number of herbicide-resistant weeds, or weeds that aren't affected by chemical pesticides, is growing and growing. And this is a great example of what we call natural selection. Speciation is one of the processes that results and increases biodiversity from natural selection. So we talked about descent with modification, right? Natural selection can lead to changes within the population. Well, if two groups in a population become reproductively isolated, then all of a sudden you can have a condition where those two small populations could become so different that they're not able to interbreed. And this is what we know as speciation. It can occur two general ways. We can have allopatric speciation, where basically the population is split by some sort of geographical barrier. You can see these two plant species don't interbreed with each other anymore because of the canyon that formed between them. And so basically over thousands of years, the two pine tree species just breed with each other because of pollen dispersal. And over time, gene flow and genetic drift and other phenomena have basically led to the two populations having different genetics and being different species. You can also have sympatric speciation, where it can happen without any sort of geographical separation, where all of a sudden a group within the population is only mating with each other through pollen dispersal because of their proximity, and you can have speciation occur that way. Sympatric speciation can happen with population of birds that don't recognize each other's songs, so they may live in the same area. They're not separated by a landmass, a canyon, an ocean, or anything. But the fact that they have developed different songs, they don't recognize a certain group as potential mates. And so if that continues, then they may not be able to mate if their genetics become different enough. They're still birds, but they're just a different group of birds, a different kind. So we have also something known as adaptive radiation, which is a process commonly seen along with island biogeography. So we can see this descent with modification on the Hawaiian Islands. These are Hawaiian honeycreepers. So there was a founding finch species, basically, that made it to the Hawaiian Islands. However, on each island, there was a different set of circumstances for these birds to survive. And as each island was populated by this finch species, certain traits started to arise based off of the needs of what was there. So you can see this bird here is really good. These two birds are really good at getting nectar out of flowers, right? These birds here are really good at catching insects. This bird here loves insects, seeds, and bird eggs, right? So that led to different beak shapes, which are essentially tools for acquiring the food that's needed. So they all started out with the initial founding species. Again, they're all birds, but they have descent with modification. Life helped them, their design of their genes helped them to adapt to the needs on each island. Another interesting example of this is the Cuban, or not Cuban, the Anolis lizard. This one happens to be, I'm not sure, it's not in Cuba, but this is, oh yeah, I'm sorry, this is actually looking at the Cuban Anolis lizards, but also, so we have some populations that are from Cuba and a few that are from like Jamaica and Haiti and the Dominican Republic, I believe. And what's interesting is there's an adaptive radiation in the length of their legs based on where on the environment that was there. Some species are found on the ground, some are in grass, some are on trunks, some are in leaves. So they basically, a certain leg length and body morphology suits them best for running on the ground or running on trunks or crawling across skinny branches. So they all have this adaptability within the population, and it happens on each and every one of these islands. So it's a pretty interesting example of what we call adaptive radiation. Let's talk a little bit more about adaptation and why it's important in environmental science, because species' ability to adapt is important. And when a species is unable to adapt, it could become an indicator of problems. So an indicator species is an organism that provides a signal that something's not right with the environment. They tend to be highly sensitive to changes in their habitat, such as increased pollution or changes in water quality. And so this change, when their population changes its size, its density, or even location, that can sure be a sign that something's wrong. And if something is wrong because of human activities, such as pollution, well, that's concerning, and it's our responsibility to look into that. So here we can see water pollution levels definitely can be indicated by the type of insect larvae that are present in the water. So when a lot of mayfly nymphs are present, that means pollution level is very low and that water quality is very good. When there's dragonfly nymph, the pollution level is again low. It's good, right? It's a good. So these are indicators that you have a healthy stream and pond ecosystem. When these start to disappear and are replaced by more shrimp or the hog louse, or if all of a sudden there's a lot of tubifex worms, that is an indication that the pollution might be high, because these species are sensitive, they die off. These can handle more pollution, and so when they become abundant, that's a sure sign that the water quality is low. If there's no life, then that may be an indicator that the pollution level is extremely high. We can also use species to indicate long-term changes in climate. And so the EPA has identified the American lobster, the red hake, and the black sea bass as giving indication of changing climate. And what we see here, if you notice from this map and these graphs down here, that the populations seem to be moving northward. And this is a consistent trend we see with a lot of species. As the climate is warming and summers are getting longer and water temperature is getting warm, these species that tend to prefer cooler water are moving northward. So sure sign that something's changed. They wouldn't do that if they didn't need to, right? This is an adaptation that is indicating a change in their habitat. Migration is also an adaptation that helps organisms to survive. And like you saw in the previous slide, we're seeing that polar bears are migrating away from areas with thawing ice to the more stable sheet ice found in the Canadian archipelago, basically in North Canada. So we can actually look at the gene flow. The genetics are showing that populations that were historically over here in Russia because of the sea ice, well, the sea ice is gone because of global warming, and now they're migrating over to Canada. We're seeing bird species are not nesting or migrating as far south as they used to. Many populations only go to a shorter distance. They don't need to go as far south. Again, this has nothing to do with a lifestyle change or preference. It's just basically they don't need to go as far south because the winters are less extreme. The food that they need is able to grow further north because of a changing climate. Now, the title of this lecture was Ecological Succession. So we're now going to come to the main point of this lecture and what we're all kind of building towards. So we've learned that ecosystems go through either regular or irregular periods of disruption. Sometimes they're caused by humans, or we use the term anthropogenic. Other times they're caused by natural disruptions, such as an ice age. We also learned that natural selection is a mechanism that allows species to adapt to these changes. And so as a result, ecosystems as a whole are built on this ability or designed with this ability to change over time and adapt to disturbances. We learned in the previous lecture that high biodiversity makes ecosystems resilient to these changes. And so now ecological succession is the concept that these ecosystems can go through relative intervals of predictable changes as a result of what happens to them from disturbances. Now, there's generally two types of succession. Primary succession is the process where life establishes itself on a brand new habitat. A barren substrate, as it says here, could be a new island that has emerged from the sea because of lava flows. And once it cools, you have bare rock. Or it could be rock that is exposed by a melting glacier, something we'll see a lot of in Greenland as those glaciers are melting. There will be new habitat. So what happens in these ecosystems? Well, this tends to be a very slow process. Primary succession is slow because it involves pioneer species such as lichens and mosses that break down rocks to form soil. So you'll notice in our example down here, we have bare rock is basically our starting point. There's no soil here. And so that limits what can grow. The only types of organisms that can grow in this area are those that don't need soil. Lichens are a great example of this because lichens get all their nutrients from the air. They don't need soil whatsoever. They can grow on rocks. They can even grow on metal that's on your mailbox or bridges. They'll grow anywhere. And they can start to break down the rock, and because of that chemical and mechanical weathering over again hundreds of years, you'll start to break the rock down into a little soil bed. Well, notice now what happens. Now that soil is starting to be present, you can have some small annual plants. Annual plants are those that have very shallow roots and they only live for one growing season and then they die off. So these are kind of like if you've ever been to the garden center or shopping for flowers, these are the plants that are very inexpensive because you plant them, they grow nice during the summer, and then during the winter they'll probably die off on you. Now, those are important plants in ecosystems because they grow, they die, and decompose, and that adds to the soil bed. Now the soil bed is continuing to get deeper, and so now you'll have more grasses and perennial plants. Perennials are those that have deeper root systems, and the top of the plant may die off during the winter, but the roots are still in place, and the plant is still alive, and so they come back year after year. So that's why we use the term perennial. These are the more expensive plants in a garden center because you have to buy them once and they keep growing year after year. All these collected together make up our pioneer community, right? We have, these are the ones that establish the community. So we say that they're pioneers. Now, as it continues, we start to see intermediate species come in. Again, the soil becomes more and more established. Now, in addition to grasses, you can have small shrubs or bushes grow, and eventually even shade intolerant trees such as pines. We say shade intolerant, meaning they love sunlight. So they do really, really well in sunlight. Now, the last stage is what we call the climax community. And you'll notice now you start to have shade tolerant trees, such as those with broad leaves. Why do they have to tolerate shade? Well, now the plant community is in competition for light and space. And so hardwood trees and broadleaf trees, such as oak trees and hickory trees, maple trees, these can exploit a niche that pine trees can't, because pine trees need a lot of light. Hardwood trees can, with their bigger leaves, can basically exploit an area of the forest where they can get enough sunlight and they can tolerate the shade better than a pine tree can. But again, notice you have a somewhat predictable measure of how you reach a climax community. Now, another interesting thing to note here is that depending on where you are on the planet, you may have a climax community or have ecological succession stop at a certain stage. So for example, in northern Canada, where we have a lot of pine forests, we call that the taiga or the coniferous forest. Sometimes also referred to the boreal forest. It has like 3 names to it. But again, the amount of rain and temperature basically stops succession at the pine forest. The shade tolerant trees don't handle the cold as well as the pine trees do, and so it stops at a pine forest. A deciduous forest or a rainforest, the climax community is going to be these hardwood trees, right? So that's where it's going to stop. In a grassland, it stops at grass. Why? Because, well, there's not enough rain to support the growth of large biomass trees, and so you only have grasses. In a tundra, it may just be small annual plants and lichens growing. So again, the end point of succession is determined by the amount, the temperature and precipitation in the area, and that's why we have different biomes. Now, the second type of ecological succession is called secondary succession. It's basically a similar process to primary succession. However, it tends to be faster. It's a little quicker because the soil is still in place, and it's following a disturbance such as a wildfire or perhaps taking out trees by a logging company. So because secondary succession starts with an existing soil bank, which contain dormant seeds and a lot of nutrients, it's a faster regrowth. So you can see this here, right? On the previous slide, if you didn't notice that primary succession will take centuries, hundreds of years. Here we're looking at about 150 years max, depending on the area. So here we had a forest fire. This could be a natural forest fire caused by lightning, or perhaps anthropogenic forest fire caused by arson or something like that. You can see that basically the forest is decimated, but the soil bank is still in place, right? And so notice we don't have to wait for the lichens to come in and start making soil. The soil's there. So now the annual plants can come in, and then the perennials. And then we can move really quickly. Within 5 years, we can have shrubs and even pine trees start to form. And then eventually they will be replaced by the hardwood trees that we see in the climax community. Again, this depends on what happens where you are on the planet, right? Maybe your climax community is the forest. Interestingly, when we look at your lawn, most people will see occasionally, like basically you mow your lawn and then your grass starts to grow. And then occasionally, if you let it go long enough, you might start to see some perennial weeds come in, right? Little wildflowers or some other weeds that are growing, especially if you don't put any herbicides on your lawn. Well, then you know it's time to lawn. And so basically mowing the lawn is essentially a disturbance. You are putting your lawn back in an earlier stage of succession, and then it'll grow back. Biodiversity will try to win the day, but then you go ahead and mow it all again, right? So if you never mowed your lawn, which is interesting, is eventually in 5 years or so, you'd have a lot of little shrubs. You might even start to see trees growing. So biodiversity is trying to win over your lawn, but we often, because of homeowners associations, have to keep mowing our grass to keep it in a very early stage of succession, and also consequently that lowers its biodiversity quite a bit. All right, little AP practice. Scientists are interested in determining the impact of the construction of a hydroelectric dam on a population of salmon that live downstream in a populated area. They measure the health of the salmon population in its current state several years after the dam was constructed. Which of the following would be best to use as a control in this study? So I'll give you a moment here to look over the answers, and then I'll reveal the correct one. Okay, so the correct answer here is the health of the salmon population prior to any dam construction, right? So the control is, again, if the independent variable is the dam, the control is what was life like, what was the salmon population prior to putting that dam in. So that would be the control. Here's a practice FRQ. On a field trip to local ponds, or let me rephrase that. On a field trip to two local ponds, a group of students observed a difference between the two ponds in the diversity of worms and insect larvae living in the mud and the debris near the edge of the ponds. Numerous factors, both biotic and abiotic, influence the distribution of aquatic organisms. Now, I skipped A because that kind of dealt with a later portion, but you have B and C here. I'd like you to go ahead, pause the video here, and attempt to answer this, and then I'll show you what the correct answers were. Okay, so let's take a look at one. So basically, you were to design a controlled experiment that would explain what was being observed. And so there were 4 parts. The hypothesis, 1 point. The hypothesis should state a specific testable explanation for the distribution of the insect larvae. Okay, right? So you'd have to identify what the variables are, independent variable, dependent variable, and say that the independent variable would be having an impact on the dependent variable. Okay, so the variable, you were to identify one, so one specific independent variable. Accepted would be like pesticides, fungicide, herbicide. Not accepted would be just pollutants or chemicals. You have to be specific, and the College Board is usually, like this word, pollutants, is usually just not a good answer on any FRQ. So we avoid just saying the P word here, the pollutants. You need to usually say a specific type of pollutant. In this case, a pesticide would have been acceptable. Part 3, the procedures. So this is where 3 points in itself with an elaboration point possible. So how you would conduct this experiment, first of all, you would manipulate the independent variable, right? In a experiment, you would manipulate the amount of pesticide given to each group of insects. You'd have a control group that would not receive the pesticide treatment. And then also you would describe the data, right? So number of larvae, size, movement, their mortality or death rate. So those would be all good dependent variables. An elaboration point or a bonus point is available here if you mentioned repeated trials. Like you wouldn't do this just once, but you would actually go ahead and do this over and over again. Or if you mentioned controlled variables, meaning the constants. What would you keep constant between the groups? And then the 4th part of this one is the results and discussion of it, right? Connecting the data to the distribution of the 2 ponds, right? If you saw a decrease in the dependent variable because of increased pesticide, then that seems to indicate what that one pond is going through. Now, part C is the definition of an indicator species and give a specific example, right? So, definition, species whose presence or absence serves as an early warning sign of environmental change or degradation. An example, well, a specific example of indicator species, and that could be any of these, right? So these are all accepted examples. There's a lot of them. We haven't really talked about many of them, and you probably don't know. In the lecture, we did talk a little bit about worms, so you could have mentioned that. But these are some examples that you could have used. And the second point for use, linking basically how they are linked to their situation. So that's all kind of like put in this paragraph to read here. Okay, so that last part C, you probably would have gotten the first point, easy to identify indicator species. Coming up with the example, this is why I always tell students it's very, very important to kind of save little nuggets of information as we go through case studies, as you listen to videos and look at examples, because this is significant. You need to understand how ecosystems, or you need to have examples to support your answers on FRQs occasionally.